everyone. Welcome to Designing Science, the IndieBio podcast. I'm Arvind Gupta, your host and the founder of IndieBio. I'm here to help share the secrets and tales from the frontiers of biotechnology. IndieBio enables the world's best scientists to build radically innovative companies. This podcast is for you. With me today, I'm super thrilled to have Dr. David Eagleman joining us. He is an adjunct professor at Stanford, the host of the TV show The Brain, CEO and co-founder of Neosensory and BrainCheck, as well as a celebrated author with numerous titles to his credit. So he's also an adjunct partner, I'm very proud to say, at IndieBio. So I'm looking forward very much, I have been looking forward very much to this conversation. We have a lot to get through in the next 45 minutes to an hour or so. So let's just go ahead and dive in. So David, how did you even get into neuroscience? What led you into this field of study?
You know, as an undergrad, I majored in British and American literature because that was my first love. And then in my last semester of my senior year, I took a neuroscience class. It was a neurolinguistics class taught by a very elderly professor, and he was using literature from the 1960s, but I was hooked anyway. And so in retrospect, actually, it was pretty obvious because my father's a psychiatrist, my mom's a biology professor. And so in retrospect, it made sense that I ended up there, but I didn't know that's where I was heading. But as soon as I got exposed to neuroscience, I thought, wow, that is the perceptual machinery by which we're viewing the world. This answers very deep things that we struggle with in philosophy class and other things. And so then it was just a straight shot from there.
Yeah, and I mean, so little is known about the brain. I mean, that didn't scare you at all as a field of study.
In fact, it's so exciting because of that. So I went to my first Society for Neuroscience conference, whatever, when I was 21 years old. And I walked in and there were 5,000 really smart people there, and I thought, dang it, by the time I finish graduate school, this is all gonna be solved. What's very weird is that this is, you know, a million years later now, and I'm still going to the same conference, and it's much bigger now, and the mysteries have only opened up and expanded, yeah.
Amazing. And so you're talking about some of these mysteries. What are some of the mysteries that you think are the most interesting and the most pressing to solve?
I mean, I wrote an article in Discover magazine years ago called 10 Unsolved Mysteries of Neuroscience. And I wrote that in 2004, it was the cover article. And they're equally as unsolved now as they were then. But there are things like, what is consciousness? How do you put together 86 billion pieces and parts and get something out of it, like private subjective experience? We don't know how to program a computer so that it's feeling something, is smelling the smell of cinnamon or the taste of feta cheese or the beauty of a sunset or the pain of pain and so on. So this is a giant 800-pound gorilla that sits right in the middle of the room. Most neuroscientists go through their day ignoring this question, but it's absolutely fundamental. And of course, a lot of people are thinking that this might open up giant things on the fringes of what that even means. But there are simpler questions too, like why do we spend a third of our lives asleep? Why do brains sleep and dream? What is intelligence? We know we can measure intelligence in people, but we don't know what it is. They're just emotions. I mean, we think about the brain as an information processing device, but our lives are very richly colored with emotion, and what is that about? Anyway, there's just most of the field is actually mystery. I do want to say that we know so much, there's so much more known than there was even when I started, but you're totally correct. It's still mostly uncharted waters.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many questions I have, like this goes into your work on Westworld, right? And understanding, that show really questioning consciousness, right? And what does it mean to be human? But also your work with neosensory, and how do we translate experience from one medium to another? But really, how do you see, you see all these mysteries, and you're studying this as a professor at Stanford. You were at the Texas Medical Center, and then you went ahead and started a company. So why did you decide to start Neosensory? And tell us a little bit more about what Neosensory is and does.
Yeah, so this is something I started in my lab many years ago. I got very interested in this idea of how the brain is locked in silence and darkness, and all it ever sees are patterns of spikes on neurons coming in. And that's all it ever has to work with. And yet we have this richly colored world with sounds and sights and tastes and smell. And so this still stands as a deep central mystery about how this works. Anyway, I started thinking a lot about this issue of what if there was another route in? What if the brain could get data via some other route? Would you actually develop a new sense? And not only the ability to sense it, but a new qualia, which is the word philosophers use for the internal experience that we have.
Qualia.
Qualia, yeah.
Amazing.
It's the subjective experience, like what vision feels like. Just as an example, you would never confuse vision with sound, with touch, with smell. I mean, these are completely different experiences. And yet, if we look in your brain, if I open up a little hole and showed the cortex and you could see the spikes, you couldn't tell me whether you're looking at visual cortex or auditory or somatosensory. Or it all looks exactly the same. You just have spikes and neurons. And in fact, the cortex is the same trick everywhere. It just deals with whatever data it has. And anyway, so the point is, why does vision feel so different, given that it looks the same as hearing or smell? So what I think the answer is that it's about the structure of the data. So visual data comes in from these two-dimensional sheets of the retinas, and hearing is a one-dimensional signal on the eardrum. And so all these things have very different structures to them. And somehow that defines the qualia. This is so weird, and I don't have any proof for this, but this is sort of the only answer that I can squint and see. What that means is if you feed in a new data stream, you get some new porthole to the brain, you might get a completely different qualia that's not hearing or touch or smell or taste, but it's this other thing. And of course, it's totally impossible to imagine in the same way that if I asked you to imagine a new color, so imagine a new color, right? It's totally impossible, which is so weird and frustrating. Like, how could it be that it's impossible to imagine a new color? But it's an internal subjective experience, and either you've got it or you don't. Like if you are colorblind, there are different degrees of color blindness. If you're colorblind, then you can't imagine a color, but you, not being colorblind, have this experience.
Right, of course.
So the point is, I think we're just a few years off from being able to feed in new data streams into the brain and experience new qualia.
Interesting.
What'll be so interesting about this is that we use language to share experience, like, hey, Arvind, I see that over there. I smell that. Do you hear that? That kind of thing. But if I'm experiencing a new qualia and you're not, then I can't, there's no way for me to communicate it to you.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. So neosensory, I get it now. New senses.
Yeah, exactly right.
So your startup, your company, is really about creating brand new senses, new qualias that people have never experienced before.
Exactly right. And so the way we're doing that, we've built a vest, we've built a wristband, we have other form factors that we're using. And they've got vibratory motors on them, and we're passing information into the skin via patterns of vibration because your skin is this incredible channel, and we don't really use it for anything in modern life.
Right.
The joke that we use in the lab is that they don't call this the waste for nothing. You've got all this stuff and you're not using it, and so we're putting in this very complicated patterns in for passing information streams. And we have no idea what the limits are or which things will be hard to learn and easy to learn. That's all going to come out in the next few years. But the point is, we can feed new data streams in there.
Interesting. And so, what have you been discovering at Neosensory so far? Anything you could share?
Yeah. So I tell you, because so it's a company, right? But because it's a company, we have to keep very narrow paths. So our first clear market path is for deafness. So for people who are deaf, what we do is we capture sound. There are microphones built in here.
That's the actual Neosensory
device. Yeah, that's the actual device,
okay,
exactly. Cool. So we're capturing sound and then turning it into these patterns of vibration on the skin of the wrist here. And we've now tested or surveyed 597 deaf people. And it's been absolutely wonderful. It's very, very moving, actually. Some people cry, some people, when we say we're going to take the wristband back at the end of the 30-day study, they don't let us have it back. Anyway, so it's been really wonderful for us to see what it means for someone who doesn't have any hearing. There are 212 genetic reasons you can go deaf. So for whatever reason, they don't have hearing, and suddenly they're getting the whole auditory world just through a different sense. It climbs up here, climbs up your spinal cord to your brain.
And the brain is actually translating this new input into what they would experience as sound.
Exactly, and the weird
That's
part,
phenomenal.
the weird part is how intuitive it is. It's very surprising how intuitive it is. So on day 0, if I give you this test, or I give it to a person who's deaf, where I present a sound of the wristband, buzz, 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 and then I say, okay, what was that? Was that a dog barking, or a baby crying, or a train, or a cell phone ringing, or whatever? People get 89% on that on day 0. So what that shows is that it's actually quite intuitive, because all we're doing is capturing the sound, breaking it into frequencies from low to high, which is just what your inner ear does. So we're just transferring the inner ear to the skin. And your brain kind of gets that language, and it says, oh, okay, that's cool.
Amazing.
Yeah.
That's phenomenal. And so neosensory was also used on Westworld, the vest.
That's right.
Tell us a little bit about that. How was that experience, and how did they use it in the show?
Yeah, so about a year and a half ago, I went down there and I spent a day in the writer's room as a scientific advisor, talking with them about the sciences. But I happened to have the vest with me, so I was showing them the vest and so on. And the writers decided they wanted to work it into the plot. And so what they did, I'll try to do this without spoilers for anyone who hasn't seen episode 7 of season 2. But so the private military contractors that drop in to deal with the hosts, the androids, they're wearing this vest, and the vest tells them the location of the androids, because all the androids are hooked up with location tracking to the network. So you can feel where they are. So if there's a host behind you 500 yards or on the other side of the wall or whatever, you can feel exactly where they are, and then you can dispatch them accordingly. So, and this is something we're actually just starting to work on with the military, but the flip side of it, which is where you can feel your colleagues. Because one of the big problems in the military is friendly fire, and people get shot by their own colleagues all the time. So this way you're feeling everybody. So you go in, I'm feeling, okay, Arvind's over here, Alan's over there, Fred is behind me by 500 yards, Tom's on the other side of this barrier here, but I can feel him. I know he's there, and I can feel as everyone's moving around, and each person feels everyone else with 16 millisecond resolution about what's happening. And so it's just a super useful way. I'm not into doing things for the military exactly, but this is just a super useful way to reduce friendly fire.
No, makes a lot of sense, and that's a real problem. So that's again another really cool application. So how has it been for you as like one of the things that we at IndieBio do, as you know, is we help scientists become entrepreneurs, and you are exactly that. And a successful scientist going to a successful entrepreneur, that's phenomenal, and it's really hard to do. Tell me a little bit more about your experience there, and like what are some of the things that you didn't expect, and some of the things that you expected that actually did come true.
Yeah, it is a tough transition for sure.
Okay.
I'm very happy that I made it, because I've published 120 journal articles in Science and Nature and stuff like that, and like 6 people on the planet read these things, and I started feeling like, and even when you're in one of these things where you're debating another lab and you've got your little World War III going on in the literature, and no one really cares, and it doesn't have the kind of impact. So what happened is I was working on this in the lab, and the whole thing about becoming an entrepreneur for me, by the way, was totally accidental, which is to say, I gave a TED talk on this. I was invited to speak at TED on what we developed, and immediately afterwards, all these VCs said, we want to fund this. And they offered what, to my mind, after writing NIH grant stuff, was a giant chunk of money to start a company. And so it was a massive left turn for me instantly in life. And so I'm so grateful that happened and that I started a company, because I feel like the impact, we're going to get this on 77 million deaf people's wrists. And that really changes the world in its little way, but in a much bigger way than writing another journal article. So I'm very happy I did it. What I've discovered is that there's a spectrum from ideation to operation, and I'm essentially an ideator. I love coming up with the ideas and stuff. Doing spreadsheets and managing people and so on, I figured out how to do that. It's not really what I love, but as I've been learning the business side of things, all these different aspects of it, I figured out for my future, the next 5-10 years, how to structure things so I'll be able to be more on this end rather than the operation end.
Yeah, no, it's really, I think inspiring people to a vision is one of the very first qualities and most important qualities as a starting entrepreneur. Being able to translate hardcore insight into a deep technical problem and then turn that into something that can be seen as human value, which is what you did in your TED Talk, right? That's in our work, that's one of the harder things to come across, but something that I think comes naturally to you, as I can see.
Thanks. It's funny because at this point, living in Silicon Valley, I've now been here for 2 years. Everybody I meet and all the young people at IndieBio and so on, they've all got that thing, and it becomes harder to remember that most of the world isn't doing that. Because my fishbowl here is, everybody in the world is coming up with cool scientific ideas and figuring out how to translate them and make a business out of it and have big impact.
I mean, is this something that came natural to you, your ability to speak non-technically yet lucidly about what you've learned? Or is this something you had to work for?
Good question. I think it came naturally enough. It was beaten out of me in grad school because I would try to write papers that were very clear, and my advisor and others would say, no, you have to phrase it this way. I said, but that just complexifies it in a way that loses some of the audience, but it's just sort of the shtick in science papers to write in a particular way, and I hated that. So I've done it 120 times, but then I ended up writing books because I felt like these ideas have such beauty to them. And everybody, as far as I can tell, when they read it, they say, wow, that's fundamentally a beautiful idea. And so everyone should have access to this stuff. So I've really enjoyed doing that. When I was a kid, I watched Carl Sagan's Cosmos, and it was just so impactful on me. I mean, it really navigated me where I thought, that's what I want to do at some point. I want to be a scientist and I want to communicate. And my parents actually, from the time I was a little kid, they never said stuff like, you're going to be the next president. They said, you're going to be the next Carl Sagan. Like, they really encouraged that the whole time. Yeah.
Very, very cool.
So that always was in the back of my head. Whenever I'd learn something new that blew my socks off, I'd say, wow, how can I phrase it? How can I start with an introduction that leads somebody into that? And then, here's the big punchline. And
Very, very cool. So it is something you've thought about in practice. I think that's, for someone like you, where it just seems so natural, right, to know that was a skill set that was developed from childhood, I think is empowering to all the scientists out there that are like, I don't know, like, look, this is what it is, and no one understands it, but whatever. No, it's actually something you can develop, this ability to communicate.
That's cool. Right, and I feel like the world has become, especially with YouTube videos and other, or at podcasts and so on, young people coming up through science now are more aware of this, and they really want to do it. So it's really opened it up in a cool way. People, I think, still have to resist when they go through graduate school, not to let that stuff get beaten out of them. They just have to stay strong and do the things on YouTube or podcasts, as long as they're doing it responsibly. Obviously, if you look at the whole space of YouTube science videos, some of them are sort of wrong, and there's not enough effort put into making sure the facts are right. But most of the time, people do right.
That's a good point. And you mentioned here, you've come to the Valley, and everyone's like working on these ideas and translating science. Are there any things that you'd like to see developed beyond? I mean, you're developing neosensory, but what are things that you think are going to be important to be developed in biotechnology and neuroscience in general?
Yeah. A couple of things. I mean, obviously there are a lot of people who come out here who want to be entrepreneurs, who develop the next version of Candy Crush or whatever, and I feel like that's a waste of great energy. But that's a general statement. As far as biotech goes, exactly as you brought up at the beginning, there's so much we don't know about the brain. Like even the most fundamental things, like what is the neural code? I mean, we can see spikes pop going on. Every neuron is popping off tens to hundreds of times per second.
Wow. And
we don't know what the language is. We know it's just zeros and ones. I mean, there's some other stuff with neuromodulation, so you can get some things that aren't zeros and ones. But fundamentally, it's just some sort of binary language, and yet we don't know how to read it.
Interesting.
Super fundamental stuff. So I feel like to the degree that young entrepreneurs can be encouraged to take on the hard problems and things that, for better or worse, that they won't be solved right away in 6 months, but instead they're really harder things to do, that's super exciting. And there are people who have made a lot of money, like Elon Musk or Brian Johnson, who have started neuroscience companies, which is awesome because they're able to look at the longer term. And there are some VCs who are able to look at the longer term and put in money and say, okay, look, this isn't about the next, Uber for ice cream or something, but this is a long play. So I love seeing that, and I think there's so much open in neuroscience. Obviously, one of the areas of neuroscience that I've been sort of talking about here is understanding the fundamental things. But the other thing that is sort of closer term, there's so many disease states and orphan diseases and so on, which would really help the world for people to attack those. And often entrepreneurs get into that because somebody in their family or some friend of theirs had that particular disease. And that's a great reason to get into something and do it. And there's just so much space.
Right. Yeah. No. As you're talking about this, it makes me realize, right? There's really two major areas of neuroscience to both invest in and build in, and that's disease remediation and healthcare, and then there's augmentation, right? The Elon Musk, Neuralink, and all of those companies. So let's take the augmentation side for a moment, right? You're augmenting in a different way where we're not invasively and taking one input and converting it into another, right? Yeah. What are the major challenges to connecting the human brain directly to machinery or the internet or things like that? Is that fundamentally possible, David?
So here's what I would say. The reason I'm pursuing this path is because we can do it non-invasively and very inexpensively. The idea of implanting electrodes, the part that worries me about that is that neurosurgeons aren't going to do it because there's always risk of infection and death on the table. And consumers aren't necessarily going to do it because as much as I want to interface faster with my phone, I'm not going to go and get an open head surgery for that. So that's why my interest has been with the non-invasive. I think in 10 years, maybe 20 years, we'll be seeing different options there instead of drilling a hole in the head and sticking something in. Something that interests me for the distant future is nanorobotics, which is three-dimensional, atomically precise printing of molecules. Let's say you put together 200, 500 atoms in a very particular way, so you make a little nano robot that does exactly what you want to do. Then here's the dream: you swallow a little capsule that has 86 billion of these guys in it. It crosses the blood-brain barrier. These little robots do their very simple little things, but they go into they cross through the blood vessels. They impregnate the neurons, and then in the neurons, they just serve as a little mesh network that says, "Hey, number 5,392,000 blah blah blah, just fired." And then and they pass it on to the next guy, and the next guy, and the next guy, and then you have some detector on the outside of the head that says like, "Okay, now we can read the neural code. Now we can know what all 86 billion neurons are doing, how they're firing. Why? Because we have a little detector inside each neuron that just says, hey, calcium just went up. That means there was a spike. Fine." This is, from a technology point of view, not impossible. I mean, this is all the pieces and parts of this are things that we're moving in on.
Very interesting. Yeah, my question was going to be around, you mentioned the neural code earlier, which seems to be extremely important in understanding and being able to read an EEG, let's just say, or a more detailed version of that.
Yeah.
And so, the non-invasive version, could you wear a cap, right, that's reading it and understanding it, and then being able to transmit it, and then potentially influence
not only read,
it.
but write. Yeah, exactly. So here's what I'd say, a couple of things. EEG is fundamentally totally limited, and people have been using EEG since for 1 century now.
Wow. Okay.
But it's so limited. One analogy that I heard years ago is it's like putting a few electrodes on the outside of the Astrodome and trying to understand the structure of baseball, because every once in a while you hear the crack of the bat or you hear the crowd go wild, and but you never get what the structure is.
And you never will, right?
And you never will, exactly. And so,
importantly.
I've got lots of colleagues who are doing cool things about analysis of EEG signals and making the analysis better and better.
Yeah.
But it's just fundamentally limited because you're listening to billions of neurons, each of which are spiking off, and you're just hearing a collective average of a bunch of stuff. So that's why we need to get something on the inside. What's interesting is the way that Mother Nature has surrounded this pink computational material with an armored bunker.
Right.
So it's really locked up in there, and it's very difficult to get stuff in there. And that's why I think if we can get stuff in from the inside, sneak it up into there, That might be the way to go. The other option, I think, is sneaking electrodes, either physical electrodes or little tiny bot kind of electrodes up into the vascular system, because you have blood vessels that penetrate every cubic centimeter of the brain. And so if you could get lots of little bots up there that are listening on the other side of the blood vessel to what are the neurons doing, you'd have infinitely higher resolution.
Interesting.
The key thing is you'd have to make absolutely sure that you're not increasing the risk of stroke, of blocking or clotting in there, even by 0.1%. And so it's a challenge that'll take many years or decades to figure that out. But boy, that's the dream.
Wow. I mean, and on the healthcare side, right? I mean, the brain is such a, it is who we are, right? It's why Alzheimer's is such a devastating disease, right? Because it takes away a person, right? And leaves their body. And so, when we talk about messing with the brain, right? Like, it's not just the side effect is potentially, losing the ability to write or something, or like, using your hand. It's actually changing as a person, right? And so it is a very sensitive area to work in. I think you're right. That's a difficult area.
Totally right. And this is, so the idea that you brought about, what if you could write to the brain?
Yeah.
And let's say you've got all these nanobots in, and so they don't just detect, but they can change something. Okay. Here's the interesting part is, if you have a disease, if you have Parkinson's or you have Alzheimer's or something, if you can write to the brain and fix that, that's awesome. And everyone's on board with that. But then what if you could make somebody a little bit enhanced or augmented? Something about that, even though it's a smooth spectrum, it changes entirely the whole conversation. Because if you write to someone's head who's otherwise not in a disease state, you are changing fundamentally who they are. And then there's, 100 years from now, there's going to be a whole category of neuro legislation about stuff like this that we can't even imagine. All the Supreme Court cases that will come up and all this sort of thing about this. But it's for us primitives living in 2018, it all seems very weird and scary.
It's all of this kind of stuff makes things like telepathy, right? If you could write to the brain and read from the brain and then send things over Wi-Fi, right? Non-invasively, that really changes everything.
Although, interestingly, because I don't think telepathy is something that we'll go for at any point. Here's why. Language is about communicating information, but it's also about deception. It's also about...
Interesting.
There's a million ways that people use language. Okay, so you've got 50 million thoughts going on, and then you say one thing that's the most socially appropriate thing to say, and you wouldn't want to be in someone else's head.
Oh my God.
Exactly.
Get me out of here.
Exactly. And just imagine with your wife or your friend or whatever, like, how do I, does this dress look okay? Whatever the thing is, there are a million ways that we use language that don't have to do with just communicating everything in our head. So I don't think telepathy will be something that people ever want to share. Just as one quick example, with the vest, one thing that I thought about was, hey, what if my wife and I could feel each other's physical signals, like heart rate, having a skin response, all these different measures to see how we're feeling, respiration rate and so on. And then, like, if I'm on the other side of the country giving a talk, I can call her up and say, hey, baby, you seem stressed. I can feel that you're stressed. Is everything going okay? But I told it to someone, and they said, hey, why don't you use this at work, where everyone at work can feel each other's? And I said, wow, that's a terrible idea. Like, just imagine Bob gets up to give a PowerPoint presentation. Everyone's like, whoa, Bob's really stressed.
It's a little too deep of empathy, right?
Exactly. Because the whole point is Bob wants to pretend like he's not stressed while he's up there giving the graphs and charts and so on. So anyway.
That's a really interesting point. Again, fascinating things as we start to really push technology and push the merging of technology and people, right? In ways, we're seeing it in genetic engineering with the ability to augment ourselves as well as remediate disease in our germline, right? Creating fundamentally a potentially new species. These are things that are becoming more engineering questions than science questions. And so, how is this more science or engineering when we're talking about the neuroscience of the brain and being able to truly remediate all brain diseases and then on like the spectrum to read, write, and recreate potentially the brain and a person.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's become clear to me from having been in the field now for 25 years, I guess, is that it's technology that always opens up to new scientific questions, which is to say, as far as the scientific theorizing goes, we've had that, we know the questions to ask and so on, but we just can't measure what's going on. And so we're stuck with the lousy technology we have, like EEGs or fMRI, which is the best technology we have in our field. I've done fMRI work for years and years, but it's so limited. All you're measuring is where the blood flow in the brain is going, which is a proxy for where the activity just was. And you just get big blobby things that tell you, okay, there was some activity in the insula and the thalamus. But that can't crack the neural code. So what we need is technology to solve that question about, here's how you can measure all the neurons all at the same time, do that data. It doesn't matter if it's real time or not, as long as you've got it. And then you can figure out the neural code. And there's like 5 different Nobel Prizes just waiting there for the scientists once the technologists have figured out how to measure it.
Right.
So with lots of these things, it's all about this, this bottom up and this top down, where they meet, that's where the action's going to be. As far as the ethics go, I think the key for us as a society is just making sure that we're always staying one step ahead, so our moral compass is clear on this stuff. Because as the technology moves forward rapidly, it's just super important that we have ethicists at the table, that we're all bioethicists in a sense, but that we have real professionals at the table and we talk through everything before we do anything.
Yeah, it reminds me of the movie, I don't know if you saw it, this dates me a little bit, The Strange Days, back in the year 2000, where people you could record your memories, and the interesting implication in the movie of that is a black market appears for experiences. Right? It was a really cool thing for me, like, so people go rob a store, right? And I get to experience what it's like to rob a store without having to rob a store, right? And so what is the universe of experiences that I could have without and literally live it by being able to replay it. Like, so I mean, I think, technologies that surround the brain are so incredibly disruptive disruptive in the innovation sense to humanity, like social media. It's like this. It's a very it's a very benign technological advancement, right? The ability to connect to others and post photos and things like that. But what is done to our brains? We now have studies on what is social media doing to our children's brains.
Yeah, I'll say a few things about that. One is that it's actually very difficult to pull off a good study on that because there's no appropriate control group.
Right.
So you can't take kids who've grown up digitally and compare them to us because there are 100 other differences, including diet and pollution and this. There's a million. Okay, and you can't find kids who've grown up on social media and compare them to kids the same age who have not had social media, because the only kids there are kids who are very impoverished or like Amish children or something.
Right.
Like there's 100 other differences. And so there's no good way to know exactly what is changing in their brain about that. I happen to be totally optimistic about what it means for kids to grow up digitally, just because of the opportunities for education and being, we were all stuck in whatever homeroom class we had with whatever lousy teacher we happened to get as a toss of the dice. But now, I run into kids all the time who say something really smart, and I say, "Where did you learn that?" And they say, "Oh, I watched this on a TED Talk," and they get the best things in the world in like a 16-minute bang, and they can go deeper on Wikipedia and so on. We had to drive down to the library to look up Encyclopedia Britannica and hope that it wasn't 20 years outdated. So anyway, I'm super optimistic about what this next generation will be. But yes, I totally take your point that what seemed like very simple changes, like, hey, what if we have hypertext transfer protocol, and then the whole world changes as a result of that. Yeah, so I don't remember what led us to this point, but it's
the advancements. When we talk about technological advancements around the brain, right? Yeah. Just how far society then changes. The dimensionality of that, and so that's what's exciting to me. Also, like you said, terrifying in the sense that if it's out of control. And so, are you like? Is there any areas that you're thinking about that you're like, that's something we really need to watch out for, and as we see the field develop.
There is one actually, and I've been thinking. I mean, this is such a weird, random thing, but I've been thinking about what this will mean for military conflicts 100 years from now. Imagine that, because so my next book is called Live Wired. It's about brain plasticity, and the way that like a child's brain is so reconfigurable. Like every experience that they have is reconfiguring their brain in one way or another, and this lasts throughout your life, which is why you're able to remember what we said 5 minutes ago and so on, because there's changes in the structure of your brain. And but it gets less as you get older. If you try to learn a foreign language now, it's harder than it was.
I've tried.
Yeah,
Icelandic, my wife, and not gonna work.
Exactly. And so plasticity gets less, but nonetheless we have lots of plasticity. Anyway, one of the questions that comes up is, wouldn't it be great if my brain could be plastic again, like a child, so I could learn language? Well, the fact is, you wouldn't actually want that, because all of your everything that you've built up in what is Arvind's life right now, if you made your brain really plastic, all that stuff would kind of go away. You'd become a new person. You'd essentially be like a child again.
Interesting.
And there's something about that whole thought that's really horrifying to me, if that becomes used as a weapon.
Yeah.
Essentially like
erasing people.
Exactly. That's exactly it. And so, here's a whole troop invading the beach. We're just gonna zap them with this virus or whatever, and their brains become real plastic, and now they're like children again. And who they were, all of their memories and experiences are now gone. Wow. That seems like a really horrific kind of outcome of really understanding brain plasticity and what we can do, and blah, blah, blah. So anyway, these are the kind of things that we just need to be very careful about.
Yeah, I agree. It's an amazing time. It is, and with great power comes great responsibility, right? And I think that's something that we as a species need to be cognizant of. That crosses borders. It crosses, because you could imagine, right? Like, we feel that way, but the head of a different type of state might not feel that way.
Exactly.
So
yeah, you're exactly right. You have used the term homo concilio for designed humans, and I think that's a terrific term, because that's where we're going. And to design things, we have to do right. The stupid part is that, when we look at the design of anything, cars, airplanes, whatever, there are lots of mistakes that have to get made before we get things right. Governments, everything. And so that's this part that's terrifying, is that over the next 1,000 years, we'll make lots of mistakes before we start getting a responsible, legislation around it.
Yeah. And so, I think I'm hopeful, though, with leaders like yourself that are thinking about these things, we'll head in the right direction in a responsible way. So what's next for you? I mean, I know you're a super busy guy, so I appreciate you coming. But like you've got TV shows, you've got startups, you've got a bunch of responsibilities. What are you focusing on? What's next?
So I'm spending most of my time right now on neuroscience, really trying to build this as a company. I've got my next several books in play, only because, it sounds like a totally stupid way to write, but that's the way I've always written, which is I just have several buckets, and whenever I have an idea about something, I just open that bucket and throw it in. So, so that's the way I've always written. But I'm writing my book on brain plasticity, which is almost done. I'm writing my next book right after that will come out, called Windows on Reality, which is about just this thing that totally fascinates me about the senses that we happen to have and the reality we see and how we take that for granted. But I've always been fascinated when you look across the animal kingdom, the way that different animals have different sorts of receptors and different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum they pick up on, or different frequencies that they hear, and so on. And presumably their reality is extraordinarily different as a result of that. So I've been talking about that for so long, I decided to write a book, and the book sort of belched out onto the page. I've got many tens of thousands of words now.
Wow.
So there's that. Then I'm writing my book called 27 Criminals and What They Teach Us About the Brain. It's about neuroscience and the legal system, which is something I've been invested in for about 14 years. And I run a national nonprofit called the Center for Science and Law. So this is about that, and I'm really excited about this. That won't come out for a few years from now, but what I'm excited about is each chapter starts with some criminal case, right? So you go in, you're like, wow, this is very interesting. But then it starts becoming weird and interesting, like, oh, this person had a brain tumor, or this person had an IQ of less than 70, which classifies them in the legal system as mentally retarded, and the laws apply differently. Or this person was under 18, or this person had this degenerative disorder, or there are so many things that can go wrong with the brain in various ways that change our decision making. anything from drugs to dementias to tumors to strokes to traumatic brain injury. So for a long time I was writing this book. It was called Neuroscience and the Law. And one of my friends said, wow, that sounds like a real sleeper. And I said, no, that's really interesting. And they said, that sounds more. So I ended up changing the whole structure of it. And now it's exactly the same material, but now it's more interesting.
I want to read it.
Cool, thanks. So I'm excited about that book. And then finally, I'm working on my next book of fiction, which is the next one after that. Yeah.
Have you done much fiction before?
I have. So this book, Some, is a book of fiction. It's 40 short stories. And actually, what's weird is that is one of the most special things in my life, that book. That book became an international bestseller. It's in 33 languages. It got turned into 2 different operas, one by Brian Eno at the Sydney Opera House, one by Max Richter at the Royal Opera House in London. And it's just been such a special part of my life. And so I really want to get back to fiction.
Cool.
Because it's a terrific channel to explore ideas. Essentially, fiction picks up right where science leaves off, which is to say, in science we have some cool idea about something, and then you've got a very rigorous way that you have to do experiments and prove that. But often things are beyond just beyond the limits of what science can address right now. Yeah. And that's where fiction starts.
Yeah, you can explore implications.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
It's exactly
very cool.
it.
That's very cool.
So I'm dying to get back to that.
So you've got a bunch of writing you're doing, and then Neosensory is moving forward.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. And I've got this other company called Brain Check, which is moving along very well, and that's just about how do we measure what's going on in the brain by using a tablet, and so how do we run a bunch of very simple gamified little 5-minute tests where it's like fun and you do this thing and we're measuring 14 different things, what's happening in terms of reaction time, cognition, perception, decision making, all these things, and we get a very clear snapshot that helps us understand things like concussion and dementia as 2 separate things. So that's getting into hospital systems and clinicians' offices all over the place, and that's really been wonderful to see that. So those are going on full steam, and then and then I'm probably going to decide on my next television show in the next month or 2.
Amazing. Any one of those would overwhelm most people.
And they all overwhelm me. I'm just hanging on by one fingernail. But
it's amazing. I know we're running out of time, but is there anything that you want to tell all the young neuroscientists that are either in undergraduate or high school or even graduate students that they're thinking, what should I do with my life? Yeah. Is there anything that you want to tell them?
To me, it seems like the most important part is to make sure that whatever you're doing is something that really resonates with you. And this is a simple piece of advice, but the thing is that people get sucked into different channels, like, okay, well, this is what my advisor is having me do, or this is what this school is good at, or whatever the thing is. But to the degree that you can steer things around so that you're saying, wow, I rotated in 5 different labs. This is the one that really, there's something there that jazzes me up. It's very important because grad school is so tough, and if you don't love it, you'll really hate it. So it would be something like that, just finding what you love. Because of the internet now, it's so easy to surf around and say, God, I found that paper, and that blew my mind, whereas all these bore me to death. So that's what I would encourage. The funny part is, I talk to undergrads all the time. For example, my cognitive neuroscience textbook is used at a lot of colleges, and so when I go around to give talks there, I talk to people who have read it. The funny part is I can't give them advice on what to do in neuroscience because the field 7 years from now is going to be totally different in terms of the questions, the technologies to be asked. So the only thing I can advise is what you find that you love. Yeah.
No, I think going into neuroscience right now, it's like going into physics 100 years ago. Exactly. It's just going to be an astounding rate of change in the next 50 years, and I'm looking forward to all the advancements and ability to help issues like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and these devastating diseases, but also the ability to augment ourselves in new ways. So, David, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate having you. Great. And I've really appreciated getting to know you and getting to work with you. You're a real blessing for humanity. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Arvind.
Absolutely.
Cool.
Okay.